Talk about a winning gamble. Takaichi Sanae's Liberal Democratic Party turning what was a wobbly coalition, the one she inherited back in October as Japan's first female prime minister, into a landslide win in Sunday's snap elections. They give the 64-year-old admirer of late British maverick Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher enough leeway to reform the Constitution and break with 8 decades of pacifism. In a nation whose population's in decline, we'll ask why young Gen Z voters broke for the anti-immigrant, China-bashing nationalist, and whether the flag waving's the way to go. Cue the conservative sweep in Thailand this past weekend. There, it's border tensions with Cambodia. And then there's what Takaichi does with her endorsement by the same Donald Trump who's preparing a spring visit to China and a United States whose military presence remains both vital for Japan and South Korea. Washington, which is of two minds when it comes to defending Taiwan and keeping the peace in the Pacific. How volatile could it all get in the region? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about Japan's Iron Lady. With us, France 24's Yuka Royer. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, François. Good to be here.
Also with us, Guy Bourdelamotte, professor at INALCO and author in French of Japan, a Discreet Leader. Welcome.
Thank you.
From Kenilworth, England, Fumihito Goto, lecturer in East Asian Studies at Sheffield University. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And from Cambridge, John Nilsson Wright, professor of Japanese politics at Cambridge University's Center for Geopolitics. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
On the go, by the way, you can listen to the show wherever podcasts are streamed. The party that seemed that had been mostly running Japan's House of Representatives for 7 decades, on and off for seven decades, seemed to have run out of steam of late. Now it's got a supermajority that will enable it to overrule decisions by the upper chamber. Takaichi Sanae eyeing constitutional reform in her victory speech, to lift pacifist restraints on defense. There you see the comparison in that graph between what Parliament looked like before Sunday and what it's going to look like going forward. And you see what a big majority it is. Takaichi stating the country that does not take on challenges has no future. Catherine Viet has more on a hardliner with attitude.
A keen drummer and a heavy metal fan, Sanae Takaichi got to display that when she drummed along to the hit song from Netflix's K-pop Demon Hunters with the South Korean president. A moment that went viral online and helped propel the Japanese prime minister's popularity into a craze some are calling Sanakatsu or Sanamania. The pink pen she uses to scribble notes in Parliament and her favorite snacks are in hot demand. Even the $900 handbag she carries is sold out.
I saw a lot of posts going viral about it. So, I think it would be nice if I could use the same thing as her.
Okay. Since taking office, Takaichi has promoted a plan to increase spending to jumpstart Japan's sluggish economy and strengthen defenses to counter China's growing military might. Relations between Tokyo and Beijing remain tense after the prime minister said she would come to Taiwan's aid if the island was attacked.
Sanae Takaichi's comment on a potential contingency across the Taiwan Strait and Japan's inevitable sort of involvement in that angered China very much. However, she has gained in stature as a tough woman, as an iron lady of modern Japan.
One of Takaichi's long-term goals is to change the country's constitution so the self-defense forces are formally recognized. Currently, Article 9 stipulates that Japan will not maintain military forces or wage war. The push comes as U.S. President Donald Trump urged Tokyo to spend more on weapons as Washington and Beijing pursue military influence in the region. Takaichi has said she's keen to forge closer ties with the Trump administration.
In order to make Japan and the United States stronger and more prosperous, I want to work together with President Trump to build a new golden age of the Japan-US alliance.
願っております。
Her message appears to be resonating, with many of her supporters saying they like her strong stance on national security.
And we'll be talking about that national security stance in a moment. But first, Yuka Royer, you surprised by the result?
I was a little bit, yes. I mean, by the turnout, I thought that with heavy snow, turnout would be much lower than usual. But finally, it was around 56%, which is
2 points higher than last time.
2 points higher than last time. So, yes, there was eagerness among voters, but also a lot of voters went to the polls ahead of the election day. So ahead of Sunday, there was already a record turnout in terms of early voting. Now, you mentioned Gen Z, but it's not just the Gen Z that was clearly sort of ready to give their vote of confidence, because remember, Sanae Takaichi framed this election to be a kind of a personal vote of confidence for her. You know, do you want Sanae Takaichi to guide this country through difficult times? And the answer was a resounding yes, it seems. Now, when it comes to that, she is somebody who presented a clear vision and who sort of sent a clear message of a stronger Japan, and a lot of people, not just Gen Z, but across all age groups, seemed to like that. And also, a lot of it came from the image that she presented of this not such a tough lady or iron lady as such, but somebody who was relatable, who liked drumming, who liked motorcycle riding, you know, somebody who came from a relatively working class background. All that sort of resonated through, it seems. And it didn't matter that she took office only in October of last year, and then she dissolved Parliament, the normal session of Parliament, on the opening day. So she had very little time to deliver on her previous promises. She did sort of pass through a big spending bill, but that was about it. And as Japan was looking for a proper budget for the fiscal year that starts in April, she kind of deliberately delayed that by organizing this election. But it didn't matter to the voters. They just gave her the mandate that she wanted.
Well, we know all about delaying budget bills here in France. Guibourg de la Motte, it was her third time trying to be the leader of the LDP. Why is this her moment?
Well, I think she arrived after Ishiba Shigeru, who was a liberal, but also, you know, really very much embodied old-style politics, she renewed the genre, really, by, you know, there were younger candidates. I mean, her direct opponent was Koizumi Ichiro, the son of a former prime minister, third, fourth generation politician. And so she embodied change. And she was endorsed by the right wing of the party, so the more conservative wing. But it didn't matter that she was a woman. You know, obviously they felt they could trust her. And she became extremely popular because she appears as resilient, brave, strong, different, a self-made woman. And I think people see themselves in her a little bit because she is resilient, she's eager, she's hardworking, she has personal difficulties with her husband who's in a wheelchair, so she's not had an easy life. Yet, you know, she always has this. She looks good. She's smiling. You know, which traditionally politicians don't smile much in Japanese politics. So, you know, all this is really quite different, and I think voters found that very refreshing.
Yeah, which is more of I guess, of a groundbreaking image in Japanese politics. I'll put it to you, Fumigoto. Is it being the first woman prime minister, or is it what you just heard Guibourg describe? You know, all the stuff that makes her charismatic, and dare she say it, smiling.
She has been quite different from traditional Japanese male prime ministers or traditional politicians. That's for sure. And also, she's quite been outspoken. So in that sense, she's been very different from I think his rivals. And also in this election, what was quite important was that implosion of the centrist Reform Alliance So many voters probably thought it was the convenience of marriage. And then I think people saw some inconsistency of the merger of two parties.
The inconsistencies in that merger. Let me ask you, John Nilsson Wright, Britain's first female prime minister, she had to show she was tougher than nails, Margaret Thatcher. It's a little bit different or not when it comes to Takaichi?
I think there's a sense in which maybe people have underestimated her. That was certainly true of Margaret Thatcher, who people didn't expect to win the leadership of the party and to take it in such a decisive direction. Takaichi, of course, is also figuratively and literally a much more colourful character than the grey, faceless men who preceded her, people like Ishiba, Kishida. I mean, it's clear just the very colour of the outfits that she wears, bright blue to their rather dull grey. The presentational side of politics, of course, is very important, as we see in those dramatic photos of her playing the drums. So breaking conventions is important. However, it's also important to say, as much as she is in that sense an iconoclast, she's also the voice of continuity and tradition because of her political mentor, Abe Shinzo. And in that sense, she can also appeal to voters who perhaps are a little nostalgic for the Abe era, which after all was from 2012 to 2020, the longest post-war tenure of any post-war prime minister. So it's a clever combination of being both novel, outspoken, untraditional, unconventional, and at the same time reminding voters that in terms of nostalgia and tradition, which is after all a big driver of populist politics, she represents a new voice, a new face. She also won this election, I think, primarily because people within her own party were concerned that the party was going to be eclipsed by the new populist party, Sanseto, which broke through in the upper house elections of last year. And therefore, she was tactically the right person at the right time to put them on the defensive.
Yeah, Sanseto on the far right. You have Team Mirai, this other small party which was expected to make breakthroughs on the far left. And so there is a shift towards populist politics. How much is Japanese politics changing? I'll start with you, John.
How much is it changing? I think we should be careful not to exaggerate the change, but there are some fundamental, I think, new indicators of new issues that are dominating the political debate. For example, immigration. Sanseto came to prominence on a policy of stopping, in its words of its leader, you see there, Mr. Kamiya, stopping the foreign invasion. That's sort of language we don't typically hear in Japanese politics. It's suddenly become acceptable to highlight this perceived threat. And of course, it's not a threat. You could argue it's a real economic necessity given Japan's demographic crisis. But of course, Sanseto used all the techniques of Donald Trump, fake news, social media, and demonization. And that represents a big change. The other change, of course, is, the big elephant in the room, which is Donald Trump. Trump 2.0 is very different from Trump 1.0. And Japan is living in a dangerous neighborhood, and its key security partner, the United States, can no longer be taken for granted. So you could argue that that change means that you need a decisive leader who has the confidence to really to say some pretty unpalatable things to the electorate. We need a stronger defense to protect ourselves. We need to boost our economic resilience through supply chain management. And we need to take a much more assertive position in promoting our national interests. All of that resonates with a more conservative message.
Later in the week, we'll be looking at the Munich Security Conference, and there will be, if you replace the word Japan with Germany, we'll be having a lot of the same questions, but the Germans still, to a degree, more in the soul-searching mode from listening to what John was saying, whereas the Japanese have understood they have to make a clean break with the past?
Well, a clean break, I mean, everything is very progressive, and she's not going to make a clean break, and you shouldn't expect a clean break. I think, it's been a progressive change. Abe changed things quite subtly, and she'll probably keep going. We talk about constitutional revision. She may or may not try it. In any case, you need a majority, a two-thirds majority in the two houses for that to happen, plus a majority by referendum. So, there's still a number of thresholds there. So if any of that was to happen, it'd have to be be a very low-key, consensual constitutional revision. So maybe just the insertion of, the idea of the self-defense forces, just the insertion of the name as such. And other than that, what she's talking about is indeed building up defense, and exactly as, I completely take on what John was saying, that she's been expressing, a clear need for an increase in defense budgets. And I'm not sure Europeans indeed have quite taken the measure of the challenges as well as the Japanese have. If you look at
why is that? Why have the Europeans not taken the measure as much as the Japanese?
Well, the Europeans need to unite. So, there's always room when you need to form an agreement at 27, there's always room for disagreement. And look at the political situation in France, for instance, where politics is so divided. The situation is not much better in England, where Keir Starmer's government is falling apart as well, from what I understand. So. In Japan, she's got that very strong majority now. She's got a mandate to carry out a policy, and she has the trust of the people to do it. And if you look at, the American national defense, national security strategy that was issued last December, it does clearly say what the expectations toward the allies are. So she just she realizes what the context and the parameters are, and so she's going to try and deliver. And indeed, there's a need. They know they need more ammunition. They've got specific things they need to target, and they've got this massive pressure from China, which people are aware of now.
Okay, so Japan not in a block of 27, an island unto itself, and you heard earlier the mention of Shinzo Abe. Takaichi's paid her share of visits to the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors World War II veterans, including those who perpetrated war crimes in China and Korea. These images from 2016, when Takaichi was Interior Affairs Minister. But, we've seen in the last months Fumito Goto a rapprochement between Japan and South Korea, with an eye towards Donald Trump, for sure, as Guibourg was stating. Can that continue if she visits a shrine to those who, in the eyes of South Koreans, are war criminals?
Yeah, probably. Prime Minister Takaichi tries to maintain good relationship with South Korea, because in order to confront China, I think Japan needs neighboring partnership. So in that sense, I think even if she has been a strong nationalism inside, but probably she wouldn't instigate Korean partners. So probably while she tries to create good relationship with South Korea.
But back in November, Takaichi triggered a storm. She stated, if China were to deploy battleships and involve the use of force, I believe this could be deemed a situation threatening Japan's survival. We can show you a map that shows the proximity of Okinawa, home to a sizable U.S. military base, as well as the disputed Senkaku Islands. There you see that map. So did she have to make such a blunt statement, Fumito Goto?
Yeah, Japan took strategic ambiguity for a long while, but I think she was pushed by opposition parties, and then I think they spoke about the potential and the risk for Japan, but it caused significant friction between China and Japan. Probably for the business community, they didn't want. I think they didn't want the Prime Minister to. I think they mentioned this risk.
First, Yasukuni. Yasukuni, she used to go. She said before the elections, her previous elections, that she wasn't sure whether she'd go or not. So that's not the elections, the present ones, but the one before when she was elected as head of the party. And so when you say that in a political context, I mean, that you may not go, it means you're not going to go. And indeed, I really don't think she's going to go, because it would be very foolish now, especially now that China's been upset by the November declaration.
Is it foolish in regards to China or foolish in regards to South Korea?
It'd be foolish to get anybody upset now over an issue that doesn't really interest anybody, frankly. Now that because when she was Home Minister, it was very different. Her audience was much, much smaller. If she was to go to the Yasukuni now, all she'd do would be create problems. So I really don't think there's any point in her going. But getting back to the Taiwan declaration, if you don't mind, in the November one, what she was referring to is really what Japanese law states. Japanese law states that if Japan's survival is at stake, Japan may use force, including for the benefit of its partners or allies. And so she described exactly, with many precautions, the kind of circumstance in which it would be possible for that survival clause to be triggered, and therefore for Japan to use force, but the circumstances described where, China would have attacked, the Americans would be intervening, therefore we might find ourselves having to intervene and as well. And in that case, she was extremely cautious. So it's really because the opposition then, as our colleague there, Goto Sensei, was saying, use the had almost set a trap, but completely what opposition should do, so in a democratic context. And she was trying to be honest, which is what voters like precisely, which is also what Professor Goto was saying, that she is an earnest person, and she was trying to be as specific as possible.
There was a 2015 law that specifically outlined terms under which Japanese self-defense forces could respond militarily. So it was a very, as you said, it was a very specific question, and she was careful in answering there. But
it didn't sound careful back in November. It sounded wow.
Well, it was. I mean, it happened during her first Prime Minister's questions session in Parliament. I think it was her first appearance there. Also, China's rhetoric stepped up much later on. At the beginning, China sort of started with the tourists advising its citizens not to travel to Japan, knowing that Chinese tourists account for a large majority of tourists visiting Japan from outside. So that was damaging to a particular part of the economy. That was the tourism industry. It took further, a few weeks later, or even a couple of months later, that China really responded with an export ban on dual-use items, which could include rare earths. So that is when China struck where it could really hurt. But then China also knows that it doesn't really want to put business ties with Japan in danger. I mean, it hasn't really moved to, for instance, ban investment from Japanese firms or vice versa. So that kind of full-scale, it hasn't developed into that kind of full-scale battle between the two neighbours.
All right, you mentioned the rhetoric. After her win on Sunday, the Prime Minister stating she was open to dialogue with Beijing. Beijing this Monday, at the usual press briefing at the Foreign Ministry, expressing its wariness.
China has consistently maintained stability and continuity in its policies and will not change them because of any single election in Japan. We once again urge the Japanese side to retract PM Sanae Takaichi's erroneous remarks concerning Taiwan and to demonstrate through concrete actions basic sincerity in safeguarding the political foundation of China-Japan relations.
John Nielsen-Wright, are things cooling off or heating up?
Well, I don't think we should expect Prime Minister Takaichi to step back from her statement. I mean, I think this is I think, a quite reasonable, a little unguarded statement that she made in the Diet, unscripted, not the usual standard diplomatic boilerplate that prime ministers get from their foreign ministry official advisors. She might be, I suppose, accused of being a little bit inexperienced. But the reality is, and we shouldn't forget this, that the security environment around Japan has worsened appreciably precisely because of Chinese, and it ought to be said, Russian intervention into both maritime and airspace around Japan. repeated incursions by Chinese naval vessels around the Senkakus are undoubtedly threatening. And I think the Prime Minister, in making her statement, was simply alluding to the fact that Japan has the right to defend itself and its own territory. The Chinese response was, I think, an attempt to bully and intimidate, maybe ahead of an election, thinking that this might undermine Takaichi. If that was the calculation, has, of course, dramatically backfired. And I think it's a measure of public discontent in Japan and fear of China. So I think while I'm sure on the kind of sensitive question of identity politics and visits to Yasukuni Shrine, Prime Minister Takaichi will be cautious. But on these clear issues of national sovereignty, autonomy, self-defense, she will continue to take a pretty tough line. She's already made it clear that she is committed to implementing the agreement that she reached with the LDP's primary coalition partner, Isshin no Kai, signed very quickly after she became leader of the LDP, an ambitious 10-point plan that includes an anti-espionage law, setting up an intelligence agency comparable to MI6 or the CIA, relaxing the rules on arms exports, even the possibility, and this is a major post-war taboo, of re-examining the prohibition against the introduction of nuclear weapons into Japan. All of that, to me, sounds like a very different type of Japanese prime minister and a very different type of agenda. But that's because, to come back to my earlier point, the Japanese public feel threatened. And therefore, they want reassurance, not only in dealing with China, but also in dealing with the uncertain question about the reliability of the United States as an alliance partner.
Donald Trump congratulating Takaichi for her win, just as the U.S. president last week endorsed the Japanese prime minister, this on his Truth Social platform. It is my honor to give a complete and total endorsement of her and what her highly respected coalition is representing. Capital letters, she will not let the people of Japan down, exclamation point. Is that good or bad, getting an endorsement from Donald Trump? Let me ask you, Fumigoto.
Yeah, from the Trump administration's perspective, Takaichi is a quite a good and useful partner because basically she is quite pro-American and anti-China, and then committed to increase military spending, and also I think the promise $550 billion of hefty investment in the U.S. So overall, I think the for the Trump administration, she is quite favorable prime minister and then a partner in East Asia.
Guibourg de la Motte.
Oh, well, it's good. It's good because it's better than having troubles with Donald Trump. So it's a good thing that he's happy in a way, because Japan needs the Japan-US alliance. On the other hand,
what do the Japanese think of it?
Well, I mean, I think they find it a bit patronizing, typical Trump. But I think they do prefer good relations with the US. So it's rather better than the other way around.
I'm not too sure what the reaction has been. I think that it's more sort of aligned with what John Nelson Wright was saying earlier about the fear that the public has, this growing anxiety. Because if you think about it, there are three neighbors that have nuclear weapons. So there's North Korea, there's China, there's Russia. Russia has been aggressive. China has been increasingly assertive in the seas around Japan. So there's this general sense that perhaps, especially among the younger generation, that there is a sense that this sort of pacifist constitution and the adherence to the pacifist constitution that parties on the left have been really sort of placing as the central part of their promises, maybe that is beginning to be seen as outdated, not responding to the reality on the ground.
Yeah, are the Japanese all in with this? The end of the pacifist parts of the Constitution, which
I wouldn't say the Japanese are all in on this, but I think they're ready to open up
for historical reasons after World War II, and
especially the nuclear prohibition. The Japanese, basically, it's a principle of not producing, not using, and not allowing nuclear weapons to be to come onto Japanese soil, and it was one of the big questions in this election that voters were asked about. I think they're still not openly supporting the idea of ditching that anti-nuclear stance. However, I think they still have this sort of let Takaichi run the country to see how much stronger she can make this country. And when it comes to reforming the constitution, there are still hurdles to be cleared, and there's a referendum to be called eventually. I think that the voters don't see their decision as being too risky at this stage.
They don't see it as being too risky at this stage, but is it, John Nielsen-Wright?
I think we shouldn't underestimate just how much has changed in global politics because of Trump 2.0. As Mark Carney said, the world order, the old order, has finally disappeared. And this is something that is recognized by Japan's politicians and I think felt by Japanese public opinion. I mean, it's really striking that, after Takaichi came out with her statements on the issue of Taiwan, it was Donald Trump, who himself is keen to work out a deal with Xi Jinping ahead of his meeting with Xi in April, who privately tried to encourage Takaichi to basically step back from this more assertive position. And it remains, unlike previous American administrations, now an open question whether the United States is firmly committed, however much they may talk about the strong US-Japan alliance, to protecting the security of its allies, whether that's South Korea or Japan. In the case of Taiwan, it's an open question whether the United States would really fight for Taiwan. The national security strategy, the national defense strategy of the Trump administration aren't very strategic. The focus on the so-called Donro Doctrine, the focus on the Western Hemisphere, the much more qualified approach to dealing with China, and the complete absence of any reference to North Korea, a country that directly threatens Japan's security interests, must surely impress on Japanese voters and their strategic and political leaders the importance of enhancing their own security preparedness. So a wise and precautionary leader, a pragmatic leader, and I think Takaichi shows herself as being both pragmatic and conservative, they're not mutually exclusive, is going to, on the one hand, want to strengthen the ties with Washington, but also be under no illusions that the United States has genuinely got Japan's back over the long term. That's why we're going to see an increase in defense spending. That's why we're going to see a much more vigorous debate about security preparedness. Japan won't be going it alone, however. It will be reaching out to other like-minded partners, building on that close relationship with South Korea, strengthening security cooperation with the United Kingdom, with the Philippines, with Australia. Now is the time, again to quote from Mark Carney, for like-minded middle powers to work together in a world in which the United States is no longer the reliable guarantor, the reliable hegemon.
Fumigoto is, again, we'll keep borrowing from Mark Carney's, the Canadian Prime Minister's line at Davos. Is Japan a middle power? And if so, could Donald Trump just throw Tokyo under the bus when Donald Trump meets Xi Jinping in April?
Clearly, Japan is a middle power, just like Canada, the United Kingdom, but the dependence, military dependence and an economic dependence on the United States is significantly bigger, but there is a growing sense of insecurity, economic and military insecurity, and then just Professor Nielsen-Wright mentioned, I think that there's a risk of abandonment. I think the Japanese society has been increasingly feeling the risk of abandonment by the United States. So that's why I think these days increasingly I think the people who support for the military increased military spending. So in that, and also I think the economic insecurity has been growing, especially among younger generations. So these mean sense of insecurity is the basis for supporting. I think the supporting the Takaichi administration.
A sense of perhaps losing money, which is more than just a sense, according to economic studies, Guibourg de la Motte. Also, this idea that that perhaps what happened during the World Wars is a fading memory for some. Does this make the whole neighborhood a more dangerous place in the Pacific?
I don't think there's any issue about, memory. The Prime Minister Abe, when he was in power, did a number of things and that were very useful. And one of them was probably to ensure that some consensus emerged in the LDP so that memory issues wouldn't be brought to the fore anymore. And he's found a position that seems to satisfy people, and so there's been no talk about memory. And I don't think, again, Takaichi-san, and you have to understand the Yasukuni again. I think she'll put it aside because she realizes that the association with war criminals is immediate in everybody's minds. But you have to realize that there are 2 million people's souls at this Yasukuni. It's about much more than those war criminals, actually. But again, I don't think that it's about history. It's not even about the war so much. Pacifism is really deeply ingrained, I think, in people's identity now, and they really like their constitution. But I think they'd be prepared to accept that a small change just to provide more legitimacy to the self-defense forces might be useful now. But again, that's a different issue from the much more pragmatic things that are needed, and that we can expect, I think, from Mrs. Takaichi, which is how to take on China in very practical terms, and that's got nothing to do with either, history or the constitution, but what kind of build-up do they need? And indeed, I think it is a middle power moment in that Japan's not alone, but a coalition needs to be built. And Japan, actually, for the past 20 years, has been building defense relationships and has been leading a very active defense diplomacy, and so that's likely to keep going. But really what you'd want, and that new world we were talking about that Mark Carney underlined, really appeared in 2022 with the war in Ukraine, and the apathy of European leaders, their lack of ability to react in view of a nuclear threat and in view also and due to their dependence on Russian gas. And I think that really triggered an enormous awareness on the part of the Japanese.
So this economic interdependence that Yuka Waye was mentioning earlier, is that a reason for the Japanese to sort of say, wait a minute, let's give China a bit of a free pass?
What they're trying to do is de-risk, which is also what the EU tries to do. They've been trying to do that for some years now because the Japanese were actually confronted to that before anyone else in 2010. That's the first time when China used rare earth against Japan. And so Japan's been trying to de-risk gradually and be less reliant on China for rare earth. And it was very prompt in adopting some economic security attitude and measures. And indeed, it's not been too difficult for Japan because it had this idea of a comprehensive approach to security anyway, had for some time. And so it's been de-risking, really, in practice for some time now. So it's going to keep going. And so it doesn't mean it wants to break away from China entirely. Like anyone else, it wishes to, for good relations with China, any other country does. But indeed, the de-risking from both the United States security-wise and China economically is important for Japan as it is for Europe, which is why it's a middle power moment.
Japan's malaise, by the way, the same as China's. Falling demographics. The population is going down and has been since 2009, Yuka Royale. We can see that graph put together by Nippon.com.
Yeah, towards the end of the year, every year we see.
How much does that weigh on the psyche of the Japanese, and in terms of when they make these choices in an election?
I mean, people have come to understand, I think, in reality, that Japan for instance, needs immigrant workers. And Sanae Takaichi hasn't been anti-immigrant per se. She's actually been calling for having immigrant workers come to help the Japanese economy where they're needed. And also her rhetoric, the anti-immigrant sentiment, the far right aspect of it was sort of carried out by Sanseito, which was much more openly racist and anti-immigrant. So she sort of struck a chord with those who would be otherwise be angry at any sort of anti-immigration rhetoric coming from a conservative leader. So I think the country clearly knows that we need. It's not just the population growth, but it's also wage growth that has been outpaced by inflation now. So there is a general sense that Japan is becoming perhaps somewhat less relevant on the global stage, and that something needs to be done to support the economy.
And so the stimulus plan, how will that go?
Well, I think that...
Spend?
No, it's not spend. She's been, Takaichi has been calling this a responsible, markets have seen this as expansionary fiscal policy, but she's been dubbing it responsible, proactive fiscal policy, meaning that she would want to spend, but on areas that are strategically important, like technology and AI. And at the same time, there's also, you mentioned, for instance, Team Mirai. That was sort of a fringe party up until yesterday, but they won 10 seats, so they have now become a force to be reckoned with, or are becoming at least. And they have sort of called for a more responsible fiscal policy. Like, while most other parties have called for cutting consumption tax or scrapping consumption tax for at least temporarily, they said no, they took a different approach, and they called for lowering the social security premiums for working people to help working people sort of pay less in social taxes. So I think there is a conscience, and a lot of younger generation voted for that party, thinking that they were more rational in their way of presenting how to improve the economy.
So one quick final question, Fumigoto, because we're out of time. Is this, do the Japanese want to go back to a golden age that's gone, or are they forward thinking at this point?
Yeah, what is important for Japan, especially Japanese companies, I think they get out of risk aversion and then make more domestic investment. That's the biggest hurdle for I think the Takaichi administration. Now Japan pour lots of money outside Japan, securities investment, foreign direct investment, but Japan does need more domestic investment. But corporate management is quite I think the risk averse and then concerned about the future of Japan. So that's why they are a bit hesitant to make hefty investment within Japan.
We'll have to leave it there. Unfortunately, I want to thank you so much, Fumigoto, for being with us from Kenilworth in England. I want to thank as well John Nielsen-Wright for being with us from Cambridge. Guibourg de la Motte, Yuke Royer, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.